Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and in the room, and also people online. So today we have our pleasure to have a joint event of the CWS Institute of Water, PWO, Water Security Alliance. It's a joint seminar, and we have the honor to have our speaker, Professor Ian Barker, to come to Exeter campus to give this talk on this making water boring again. I'm very keen to listen to how can we make water boring. So I believe many of you will be also interested on this topic. So I give to you here.
Thank you, Albert, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you joining online. Thank you for joining us this morning. Albert said he's intrigued by the title of Making Water Boring Again. I'm also intrigued by it because this is the first presentation I've ever given where I've had a title and then no idea what I'm going to say. So I'd better explain how this has come about. I used to be on Radio 4 Today programmes, list of people to ring whenever there was a watery issue that just needed someone to commentate on. I've asked them to take me off their list because I'm not very good in the mornings. But about 18 months ago, they rang me up and said, can you talk about the latest furore about sewage spills? And everybody getting very grumpy, understandably, about all these overflows going into the rivers. And I did my bit, and I came off and I thought, what's happening? Because water didn't used to be like this. You know, couldn't we just go back to how it was when I started my career, when, you know, back in the last century, everyone just quietly got on with their job. And so I was wondering, well, what would it take to go back to making water boring again? But also thinking, actually, would we want that? Would we want it to be like it used to be? So this presentation is the result of me trying to make some sense out of a lot of random and apparently dissociated facts and events. And I must stress before I continue that the views that I express are very much my own, and not those of any organisation that I'm associated with or a director of or anything like that. This is just me speaking and getting a lot of things off my chest. So let's begin by going back in time. Once upon a time, back in the last century, the men who worked at the water board, and they were nearly all men, were regarded as doing something important. What they did was seen as something that was respectable, but perhaps a bit staid, and possibly even actually a bit boring. You know, it was interesting for them, of course, but for the public, they weren't quite sure what it involved, apart from lots of pumps and pipes and stuff like that. And very much a case of, trust me, I'm an engineer. I joined the Yorkshire Water Authority pre-privatisation as a hydrogeologist, and the first and only piece of career advice I was given was that I could never hope to progress within the water sector because I wasn't an engineer. There's something to take from that, I think. So that was how it used to be. Everyone quietly got on with their jobs. And then water got interesting for a while. In 1976, you may be aware there was a very significant drought then. If it happened today, the severity of drought and the consequences would probably bring down the government. Reservoirs dried up, and everyone pulled together in ways that you wonder whether they would today. People were exhorted to shower with a friend to save water, and everyone thought, oh, that's all a bit of a laugh, isn't it? But there were standpipes in the street in many parts of England, including here in Devon. And everyone sort of just got on with it and didn't think too much about the inconvenience. Today there would probably be a riot, I suspect. The government in August of that year appointed Dennis Howell as Drought Minister, and within about 3 weeks of him being appointed, he was asked to do a rain dance. He was asking people to watch out for anybody using a hose pipe, but within about 3 weeks of being appointed, it rained and didn't stop. And we ended up with floods, and he became Minister of Floods. So all of this got water in the public eye in a very different way. But then after 1977, everything just went back to normal, and the men at the Water Board carried on doing what they had always been doing. But then, fast forward a decade or so, everything changed fundamentally, and the Conservative government at the time decided to privatise water as the last of its major privatisations. And I'm not making political points, but the public was split in terms of their views about privatisation. People were offered shares, the opportunity to become an H2 owner. About 3 million people bought shares and then very quickly sold them at a considerable profit, and they were happy. As you see from the headlines, the public dived in and bought the shares. And Margaret Thatcher took the view that this was going to be a very successful privatisation. But not everybody thought that it was a good thing. And in the House of Lords, a debate which is recorded here in Hansard, the parliamentary record, that pretty much captured what the majority of people in the country were thinking, which is that water is too precious and too important to sell. And if you have a look at the extract from some of the speeches in the Lords during the privatisation debate, they talk about the fact that opinion polls are running heavily against it. And some fairly unparliamentary and strong language. Will the Minister of State for the Department of Environment, Earl of Caithness, will he ask the Prime Minister to stop acting like a petulant matriarch and abandon the whole business? And the answer to that was no. And then another peer said, this is an idiotic and ill thought out measure. Will he listen to the growing chorus of dissent and opposition from Conservative members of Parliament? So people within the Tory party who want privatisation were saying, we don't agree with this. And then when you look at what the government said, the Earl of Caithness, who was the Minister of State in the Lords, so representing the government, to try and justify and promote privatisation, he said, it's the only way to dissociate industry ownership from its regulatory framework. Now, that's just a bit disingenuous, because it was only a little way down the track that the government was persuaded or forced to agree to setting up independent regulators of the privatised companies. So in other words, what's now Ofwat, the Environment Agency and Drinking Water Inspectorate. So, yes, set up independent regulators, because one of the issues that I had within the Yorkshire Water Authority, and it was my job to internally try and regulate what they were doing, was it's very difficult to regulate the company that you work for and get them to actually admit failure. So an independent regulator was really important. But the most important point is probably this: only through privatisation can we access private sector funding. And the issue was that from the late 70s through to the late 80s, the water sector had been grossly underfunded. But most of the money came from grant and aid from government. That wasn't enough to fund them what was needed in terms of just basic maintenance, let alone enhancement. And the government was faced with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and that's probably the single most important European directive in terms of cleaning up rivers and the inshore marine environment. And if you think that rivers and the seas are in a poor state today, you should have seen them, as I did and one or two other people in the room did, pre-privatisation. I used to come down to Devon, Cornwall from Hampshire. I used to come down on holiday, and happily swim amongst the sewage and go fishing near a long sea outfall, because that's where the fish were fattest and biggest. That's how it was, and that's what the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, by and large, cleaned up. The Lords were not convinced by the government arguments. As you see, the Minister's presentation of the 3 least convincing arguments for water privatisation. And it's interesting and very prescient that one Lord Malloy asked the Minister to clarify the anticipated level of foreign ownership. There was a lot of concern that water would be sold off to foreign ownership. And given that the water authorities, as they were, owned very large swathes of England and Wales, that would mean that a significant part of the country would then go into foreign ownership. Despite all the opposition by the public and within the Lords and by some Conservatives, the privatisation went ahead, as we know. Now, we are where we are, living in interesting times where everyone has a view based on a deep-rooted feeling about the specialness of water. So let's try and get behind why do people feel that way about water? Why is there such a strength of feeling? And to understand that, we need to go back 50 or 60,000 years. I was fortunate enough to do my master's degree in Australia, researching the formation of the precious opal deposits in the outback. And I was given a Land Rover, and my safety briefing was take plenty of water, and if you break down, don't leave your vehicle. And so, as a naive early 20-something, I set off into the Australian desert, doing my field work, and got back to the office safely. And I come from Hampshire, and the Australian outback's very different. And back at the office of the mines department where I was seconded to, I asked an Aboriginal colleague, it's just so dry. There's no water there at all. And he said, water is all around you if you know how to look. And for tens of thousands of years, the Australian Aboriginals have held water to be sacred and special. And water is a key part of the dreaming narrative. And this lady, Janet Long Macamara, who's a lovely artist, and I've got some of her pictures, paintings, has produced this picture and other similar ones about underground water dreaming, recognising the dreaming stories about the connection of ancestral beings to sources of water integral to the Aboriginal culture. So, as you might expect, living in that environment, water is absolutely fundamental and special. But closer to home, and slightly more recently, just over 2,000 or so years ago, back in the era of the Iron Age, in many of our rivers, wetlands, and lakes and ponds, sacred objects were deposited. They were often broken before they were deposited. And this is from a hoard found in a little lake on Anglesey. There are many of these from across the British Isles and all across Europe. But water was sacred to the Celts, and sufficiently sacred for them to leave some of their most special objects. They believed that water had all sorts of powers and was so important that they put some of their best things into the aquatic environment. And water's always been special. In myth and legend, the Lady of the Lake legend, near where I live, on the edge of the Brecon Beacons, in the Western Beacons, there's a lake called Llyn Fanny Van Vach, which has its own Lady of the Lake legend. It's quite an eerie and special place. So for myth, legend and folklore, water's always been an integral part of it within the culture of these islands and pretty much every culture on Earth. And people still have that other relationship with water, a special relationship with water and watery places isn't confined to the past. All across the UK and much of Europe as well, there are holy wells which are still visited, and where, as you see here, people have tied strips of cloth and ribbon onto the tree behind. And are visited because people believe that they have some special power in terms of healing or rejuvenation. And this one is at Trelech in Monmouthshire, but there are, let's say, hundreds all across the country. Now, you're probably thinking here, this is all very interesting, but we're in the 21st century, so is this still relevant? So I'd just like to try something, if I may, please. And you can, for those of you online, you can do this as well. I'd just like you to put your hand up if you have ever thrown a coin into a fountain, or if you've ever given a coin to a child to throw into a fountain, or into a wishing well at a school fete, or whatever. Don't be shy. We've actually, for those of you at home and can't see the audience, probably more than half the audience have put their hands up, and I suspect amongst the 90 or so people that are watching this online, the majority of you have probably also put your hands up. Now, I'm here at Exeter in the Centre for Water System, probably the world premier technical and scientific establishment in terms of the study of water, and colleagues here have cheerfully admitted to doing something completely bonkers and irrational. And, you know, we all know about the Trevi Fountain in Rome, and people throwing coins into that. And I happened to be in Budapest a few months ago on business, and I wanted to visit the Matthias Fountain, which is known as the Trevi of Budapest, just to see whether within Buda Palace here, whether people were doing the same thing. And yes, of course, you know, the floor of the fountain was absolutely littered with coins. So why are people doing that here in the 21st century, still believing you can throw a coin into a fountain? I won't ask if you've made a wish, but people still feeling that specialness with water. So people do it in all sorts of ways, not just throwing a coin into a fountain. People believe in the purifying nature, purifying power of water, that somehow if you put something into water, it will heal it and make it go away. This is a chalk stream in Cambridge, the Cherry Hinton Brook. It's a really nice little stream that suffered a lot being within an urbanised environment. But there's a pair of shopping trolleys in here. I don't know if people put two of them in, hoping they'll mate. There's lots of other places they could have dumped those shopping trolleys, but no, they put them in a chalk stream. And sometimes people go a lot further than just a couple of shopping trolleys. They put in a much more impressive hoard of objects into a stream, believing that somehow the stream will get rid of them. And I think, why go to all the effort of tipping your sofa down into this little stream? It'd be so much easier just to leave it in a lay-by. But no, you put it in a river. But of course, it's not just the public who dump stuff in rivers and hope it'll go away. And this is what we've seen over the last few years, as there's been much more public awareness because there's been much more information available in terms of the number of spills from combined sewer overflows, and also the performance of wastewater treatment works. And you have to think, amidst all the sort of fury and recriminations and blame and posturing, there are two important considerations or conclusions that have been overlooked. The first is that for the first time ever, probably now the entire population understands how a sewer network operates, has insight into water company operations, why storm overflows do spill, an insight that they've never had before, and that can only be a good thing. It would have been better if it had been done in a more measured way, with clearer explanations from water companies, regulators and government, with a clearer understanding of the trade-offs involved in terms of cost, benefit, impact on the environment and so on. But we are where we are. But the positive is that people really understand in a way they never did before. how the wastewater system works. And the second thing that we need to ask is, why are people so cross? Most people have very little daily contact with rivers or water. Very few people as a proportion of the population enjoy wild swimming. And yet it seems everyone is angry. And I've had lots of conversations with this. And about 3 years ago I had the privilege of advising the Parliamentary Environmental Audit Committee for its inquiry into river water quality and sewage pollution. When we were putting together the evidence for that, when I was talking to the MPs on the committee, people gave me the main feedback was, it's just wrong. Rivers are special and we shouldn't abuse them like this. And that reaction maybe shouldn't be a surprise when you look back at what we've inherited in terms of the relationship with rivers and with water. But there is some research which looks in more detail and tries to understand that people still have a deep relationship with water. And that's true for all the major religions of the world, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. One of the roles I have is as an independent non-executive director with South Staffs and Cambridge Water. And Cambridge Water, with some other water companies, got an innovation grant from Ofwat to do some research into the relationship between faith and religion and water. So we teamed up with the University of Cambridge and the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, and some research led by Dr. Anastasia Bada looked at how different faiths view water and the extent to which it's important within those faiths, and the way in which they use water within their religion and within their ceremonies and so on, but also in their daily life. The research has just been published just the last week or so, and also Waterwise, the water saving NGO, has published on its website a toolkit to help water companies and others engage with people of different faiths to help them better understand water. And one of the things that came out from the research was to lay the myth that some water companies take a view that they have hard to reach communities, and therefore you don't bother trying to talk to them about water saving or whatever. There is no such thing as a hard to reach community. It just means you haven't engaged with that community in a way which resonates with them. And this research by Anastasia at Cambridge, I think, very much brought that home. You need to engage with people on their terms. And some of the key messages that I took out from the research and heard at a special seminar they put on about 8 or 9 months ago was there was a real pushback during the interviews that Anastasia held with different communities against the view that water is a commodity, or even a resource. It's certainly not a resource to be exploited, was the feedback that she got. Humans have been given the responsibility to look after water. It's a source of life, and people living in urban Cambridge still felt that deeper connection. And that every living and non-living element of the environment has its own rights that need to be respected. Water and nature at large has boundaries that humans should not overstep. And then the concluding comments there in black. One particularly powerful response that came out during these structured interviews was from a lady who lived in Cambridge all her life. And she said that she's grown up there, she's drunk Cambridge water throughout her entire life, and she said she has chalk water in her bones, and she feels a sense of grief at the sense of the River Cam in Cambridge. But that deep relationship with water, which we saw a microcosm of it there in the research in Cambridge, is increasingly visible in all sorts of ways that a decade ago would have been unimaginable. Near where I live is the River Wye, which is the longest river, well, the fourth longest river, I beg your pardon, in the UK. It's grossly polluted by effluent from chicken farms and other sources as well. I never thought I would see gross algal blooms in an English river in the way that I've seen them in other places all over the world. But most summers the River Wye turns green from algal blooms. And there's huge demonstrations of concern, all sorts of marches and campaigns and so on. And this is the goddess of the Wye, which sort of epitomises the strength of public feeling. But that's spread in all sorts of unlikely places. It's resulted in a really strong band of, now across the country, we're seeing thousands of citizen scientists monitoring water quality, monitoring invertebrate populations to better understand the health or sickness of the rivers near them. We've seen people like this guy. This is Paul Powellton. Paul, if you don't know him, is a lawyer and co-founder of Lawyers for Nature. And in August 2024, he was a juror at a trial, and he wanted to swear his oath on a vial of water from the River Roding. And he lives on a boat on that river, which is a tributary of the Thames in London. And he said to the judge, "The river is effectively my God, and I hold the river to be sacred." So the judge had quite a long conversation with him about how he really felt about the river and the water, and agreed that, yes, he could swear his oath in terms of serving as a juror on that vial of water as a legal first. And I talked about the River Wye and the fact that some unlikely people joined in on that. And the church in Wales commissioned a statue of the Virgin Mary, and that undertook a 75-mile canoe trip from Hay-on-Wye downstream to the estuary to raise concerns about the state of the river. And then a few months afterwards, the Archbishop of Wales, no less, chaired a Rivers Summit and said we have to change the way we look after our rivers and their ecosystems for the benefit of us all. A decade ago, I don't think I could ever have imagined that that sort of thing would be happening. But water is very much front and centre for many people now. And with perfect timing for this talk, and I didn't know this was coming, Robert Macfarlane, who's an author I hugely admire, a nature author, published this, Is a River Alive? Asking that question, which many people have asked and most people really struggle with. And I'll talk in a moment about one or two of the things within his book that got me thinking in the context of this talk. So, I start off talking about how do we make water boring again, and is that a good thing? And the thing that probably, for me, best epitomises how do you make water boring again. Well, first of all, you just think about the pleasure and the enjoyment that you get from being near water, and think, actually, should water be boring? And this is the River Usk at the eastern end of the Bannau Brycheiniog, the Brecon Beacons in South Wales, and I live not very far from this, and I walk my dog along the banks and see this bridge every morning. That always makes me feel better and sets me up for no matter how bad all the team's meetings I'm going to face during the day. I've had my dose of river first thing in the morning. And for me, that shows why water can never be boring. The river is different every day. But in a staunch effort to try and keep water boring, this is my water bill. And I happen to be served by the company Welsh Water, but this could be any bill from any water company, so I'm not picking on Welsh Water. but it couldn't be any more boring. It's just a pure transactional, technocratic approach with me as a customer. These are just 2 pages from a total of 5 pages, most of which actually look like this. Does anybody read any of this? I doubt it very much. But could this be any more disconnected from what we're discussing and what we saw in the last slide, that lovely picture of the River Usk? This is the totality of my relationship with the water company that serves me, other than the professional relationship I have from time to time. This water bill would have looked just the same pretty much 20 years or 50 years or so ago. The only thing that maybe is slightly positive is you'll see down the bottom right, if you just about read it, it tells me my average daily water use. And it tells me that I use about 220 litres of water a day. I have no idea from this bill whether that's good, bad or indifferent. I happen to know because I'm me, that works out to about 70 litres per person per day, so I know that the Barker family are doing okay in terms of water consumption. But I suspect the overwhelming of people seeing this bill have no idea what that little bar chart means and whether, as I say, it's good, bad or indifferent. But the bill gives no clue at all as to where my water comes from, and it comes from the River Usk that we saw in the last slide. It gives me no clue at all about whether that river is damaged by over-abstraction, and it is, badly. It gives me no suggestions for what I can do to help reduce my consumption, to reduce that stress on the river, and also save some money along the way, because of course I'm on a meter. It gives no clue as to where my wastewater goes, and whether the river it discharged into is suffering from pollution, and it's the River Usk, and it's suffering badly from pollution. It gives no suggestions at all as to how I can reduce the potential for creating sewer blockages, so that the CSO I walk past every day and look in on would flow less frequently. So it's purely transactional. We send you a bill, you pay it, that's the end of our interaction for another 6 months. And in the meantime, each year I throw my £400 into the Welsh Water Fountain and make a wish for a healthier river. So in this introduction to Is a Water Alive? Is a River Alive? Robert Macfarlane sees rivers differently and expresses his view in a way which I think is probably starting to resonate with people, judging by the reaction to this that we've seen in just a few days. In a previous life at the Environment Agency, I used to be responsible for implementing the Water Framework Directive, which divides all our rivers and everything else up into water bodies. I never once thought that the term water body is an interesting use of language, but Robert highlights that. And I, and probably you also, will have seen rivers that we can just look at them and see, well, it's dead, like the River Thames was in London 30 years ago. But I've certainly never thought, well, when a river's not dead, does that mean it's alive? And that's the case that Robert makes in his book. Very eloquently and compellingly makes an argument that if a river is not dead, then is it alive? And in just a few days, his book's generated a remarkable and overwhelmingly positive response. And all across the world, we see rivers being given rights. All across the UK, people are viewing rivers differently and are concerned about how we use and abuse them. But what does all this mean for those of us who work in the UK water sector? The traditional technocratic and transactional relationship with customers is increasingly at odds with what people want and expect. And it's clear that water is too interesting and too important to try and return to the days when it was boring, no matter how much we might try. And that's probably not a good thing to do. We want people to engage with water and think about their interactions and get the joy from water. But the challenge for us working in the sector is how can we deliver safe drinking water and effective sanitation in a way which reflects what a growing number of our customers are telling us they want. And what they're telling us they want is to treat rivers with respect and to acknowledge that water is not just a resource to be exploited. And if we keep that in mind, then we should never return to the days when water was boring. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
I'm
definitely. It's not
very happy to take questions in the room and online, and questions and comments and views, because I'm sure people have views.
Yeah, thank you. So this talk definitely is not boring. It's very interesting, right? Any questions in the room?
I know this is very different for a Cambridge CWS talk because there are no numbers, and it's not a technical talk at all, but the aim of the talk is to try and get people thinking, so hopefully I've done that.
Thank you. Yes, Trevor?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Fascinating talk, as always. Probably an impossible question, but I do like asking impossible questions. So you've articulated where society is and their discontent and the actions they've taken. Given there probably is no quick fixes to many of the issues that society have with water, particularly with climate change increasing the pressure on droughts and CSOs, bills likely to go up, etc., etc., we've already seen some really unfortunate situations where chief execs of companies have been threatened, staff have been threatened, and not gone to events, etc., and they're a rarity. But given there's no quick fix to many of these problems, even though we might make some progress in the short term, where do you think this could go in terms of societal response? Do you think there's a bigger risk than the issues we've already seen with society pushing back on this?
I suspect online you won't have heard that. That's from Trevor Bishop, who many of you will know. And Trevor's saying there are no quick fixes in this. And we're seeing, very sadly, colleagues who work within water companies threatened and abused in the street and elsewhere. And in terms of the societal response, where do I think this is going? And I think that's probably an impossible question to answer. I do think that Robert hasn't paid me to plug his book, River Alive, but it might seem like it. But I think it's an incredibly helpful book because it's getting a debate going about what our relationship with water should be. And I think that we probably haven't seen so far from technocrats, regulators and others, is humility and empathy. And I think that may well be what the public are looking for. What we also haven't heard from government and regulators, and I mentioned this, is an explanation of the trade-offs, in that even with infinite money, we can't have everything that everybody wants all at once. That's just physically impossible. It's also unaffordable, and we need a clearer explanation of what those trade-offs are between river health, affordability, and what good looks like in terms of not just meeting public expectations, but also meeting the expectations of a river. If you put yourself, in the mind of a river, think, well, what would make me happy? And just very quickly, I think Trevor will know this. I made the mistake of giving an entire lecture talking to a fish glove puppet, trying to understand what's it like to be a fish, coping with all this pollution and over-abstraction and so on. And that's just simply a way of trying to get people to think about, we look at it from a very human point of view. If you look at it from a point of view of a fish, then what would good actually look like? We don't have that debate, we don't have that discussion about trade-offs. So I think trying to cultivate a debate rather than just shouting at each other, I think would be a good start.
Yeah.
That's not a very good answer, but it's a really impossible question.
It was an impossible question.
Any more impossible questions?
Yes.
When you've got the slide here showing most people's interaction with the water company is through the bill that they get, and I think that for a long time, and even now in the media, when you hear about water companies, it's either CSO spills or river health, or it's bills are going to go up by this amount or not this amount, and that's kind of it. So I'm wondering if, like you're suggesting, the way that the bills are presented to people has impacted the way that Ofwat and the media is reporting on what the water companies are doing, and that's kind of shaped the whole discussion. And whether or not, you mentioned the bills have got 3 pages of stuff that you don't read, but if we filled that with things that we would like people to read rather than just kind of financial information, whether or not people would read them, whether or not that would make a difference.
Yeah, really good question about if our bills were more informative with information that people would want to read and would find helpful, would that help to better shape the discussion? I think categorically yes, and most water companies are now in the process of rolling out smart meters, which ought to be a brilliant vehicle for better engaging with their customers and also producing more informative bills. And what this bill and most bills fail to do, as I said, is to make the relationship between the water that comes out of your tap and the water that's in a river that the fish wants. And I think if bills can make that connection and better show people how they can do their bit as well, then that can only be helpful. But alongside that, the water companies need to demonstrate that they're tackling one of the things that people most object to, which is what they perceive as high levels of leakage, and with some companies it's still unacceptably high, where companies are going on leakage so that they're doing their bit as well, when they're also asking their customers to play their part. But yeah, good question. Thanks. Some of the ones online. In Hall, what recommendations would you make to the government's independent water review? There's an awful lot being said to the Cunliffe review, and they've got an impossible task to actually make some sense of everyone's opinions. My personal view is that the thing that's lacking is people standing back and thinking, well, what do we need in terms of governance? Because if you look at what's happened since privatisation, even before then, the governance of the water sector has sort of grown up piecemeal, and the legislation and all the regulations have grown up piecemeal. And the OECD have a global water governance initiative and a set of 12 principles of good water governance, which the UK government has endorsed but never done anything with. I think a good start for the Cunliffe Review would be to actually look at those principles of good water governance and see how we do against them. I've done a sort of back-of-the-envelope check, and we fail on all 12 to a greater or lesser degree. I think if you get the governance right and the oversight right, and governance isn't just boring stuff like regulation, but it's also about communication and levels of support and so on. If you get that right, then I think that will go a long way to addressing some of the issues. But it doesn't appear to be part of the Cunliffe Review in a structured way that I have seen so far. An interesting question about one of the key considerations here is how and from whom do you centralise and drive that advocacy and messaging. I'm not sure that centralising is fine, but I think it also needs to be local, so it resonates more with customers. I think this is where trade and membership bodies have a significant role more broadly. How long would it take to shift public perception and awareness and who we're targeting? Don't imagine any significant changes at consumer level with this AMP cycle. Where does targeted messaging have the greatest levels of return on investment? Another impossible question. Thank you, Adam Cave, I think that was. Yeah, I think just simple top-down messaging, government telling people what they should think is never a good idea. I think messaging needs to be local and from people and organisations that people trust. And NGOs, certain public figures that people trust and respect, I think can do a lot. I think professional bodies, professional membership bodies, again, are a source of trusted advice. And at the moment, so many people are reluctant to, if you like, wade into the debate, fear of getting knocked down. But I do think if there was more communication from trusted sources, that can only help. I can't see any more messages online, but I'm sure they exist.
Earlier one, so wood and the general public they don't tend to understand trade-off. How do we best explain?
General public don't understand trade-offs.
Yeah.
People make trade-offs in their personal lives all the time. Do I take my child to Disneyland in Paris, or do I take them on a much more educational holiday and interesting holiday by, say, just going to London and seeing the sights there, and you weigh up the costs, the benefits, and everything else. Everything is a trade-off, but in one way or another, in terms of many of the daily decisions that we take. I think where government is less good, and again, this is something that the OECD pushes very hard in terms of making trade-offs transparent, is what we see from government and regulators on water. It's not saying that, no one's saying you can't have everything all at once, and what the implications are of doing one thing and not another, or delaying something. Is that going to make the situation worse, or is it just sort of a holding pattern? So it is just having that conversation and critically engaging with people. And one thing I've found most interesting is sitting in on various conversations between a water company and their customers. And when you get into an informed conversation, in an informed consultation, where the people you're engaging with are sufficiently well informed to make sensible comments, you can get amazing feedback around these trade-offs, and people do really get it if they're given time to understand the issues in a more deliberative debate. So, I think there's a lot that water companies could and should do in the run-up to the next investment period in terms of the trade-offs with the investments that they will need to make in terms of drinking water, but also environmental protection. But I'd like to see the regulators playing a part in this as well, because it's too easy just to regulate and say, do this, and then leave the water companies to try and pick up the pieces in terms of how do we do everything, in a way that's affordable.
Well, question or comments on? Yes, Adrian?
You mentioned the professional bodies, and yet they themselves have their figureheads.
Yes.
Are also the figureheads of the problem organisations, shall we say? It's not a great look if if you wish to persuade the public that you can trust us as professionals when the heads of those professional bodies are the chief execs of the water companies doing the polluting, the flooding, whatever faults that you wish to find with them?
Yeah, the question is around, some professional bodies have close relationships with senior people in the water sector who are the ones that are being vilified by the public. Is that a great look in terms of being trusted? I think one would need to choose one's messaging carefully and clearly. And for me, the critical issue is whether the people who are giving you the message are professionally qualified. So, say, have a chartered registration, and that commits them to a code of practice, a code of ethics, to continuing personal, professional development. And if you want your accounts done well, you go to a chartered accountant. If you want a coherent conversation from a trustworthy person on all of this, then you'll go to a chartered engineer or chartered scientist or chartered environmentalist. And I think there are lots of people, not at chief executive level, but working hard within the communities as members of those professional bodies who I think would be great spokespeople in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. But it's finding the right person to make sure the messages don't inadvertently backfire.
So can we get these figureheads to also be chartered members of their particular organisation?
I think that would be a very good thing. For example, I'm closely associated with the Institute of Water, and we have a very comprehensive code of conduct which we uphold carefully, and that applies to all members regardless of...
It's the Institute of Water I'm thinking of.
Yes.
There are a couple more comments online.
Yeah.
So, would you like to answer the last one? So there's several. So I think that we'll respond to what your comments, but that I would like to pick up this one from Will A. So, hi Ian, you have spoken a lot of customers with the water company. We are all aware that water system is impacted by much more than water companies, such as agriculture, highways, industry abstractions, AI and the data center, especially relevant at the moment. How do you think we best educate everyone on the whole system and its interactions to the influence behavior and the policy change to the best impact the water environment? How do we need something similar to carbon impact net zero messaging equivalent in water?
Yeah, good question. The focus for much of this talk has been around the water companies, but a very important point that actually the water system is impacted by agriculture, highways runoff, industrial abstraction, like AI data centers and so on. So how do we educate everyone on the whole system? And it is important that people do understand that whole system. I think we sort of lost touch with the water cycle and all those interactions. But what we've seen, certainly, and I've seen locally with the River Wye, people are looking at that holistically in terms of all the pressures on it. And it's clear that a lot of the citizen science movements, who are hugely influential now, do have that understanding of all the pressures on the water system. We need to support them in spreading that message out. There's also a point about isn't the real issue related to skills and labour, simply not enough people in the sector to develop the scale of work. There's a couple of telling statistics on this. The water companies are saying that in AMP8, the investment period that has just started, they propose to spend over £100 billion in investing their customers' money to improve service and create a better environment. They've also said that they need an additional 30,000 people to deliver that, so 30,000 skilled people, not sure where they're coming from. But in that same 5-year period, there's also 30,000 people who are due to retire, a sort of silver tsunami, it's been called. So there's a skills and recruitment time bomb ticking away there in terms of the skilled people and the resources needed to deliver everything. And that's just quietly sitting there with no clear answer about actually how is everything going to deliver. And it's not just within the water companies, but it's all the supply chain as well, the consultants and the contractors that are needed. Where are they going to come from? And within academia, have we got enough people studying the right things, developing the tools and techniques which will actually help the water sector work smarter? And I'm not just saying that because I'm here in Exeter, but because we really do need colleagues in academia to help us in terms of doing things better and faster.
Thank you.
That might be a good note to finish on, Albert.
Okay, I think we might have time for one more question. So, Vivian L, is there a tension between the governance structure and the communicating the complexity of water management and individual responsibility, especially the focus on private companies to take the lead on education and incentivizing behavior?
Yeah, I think, is government sufficiently joined up? I've been fortunate to work all over the world, and water is never well joined up at a government level, because water covers not just DEFRA, but also trade, transport, you name it. And yes, better joint and spatial planning, better join up within government in terms of the messaging, I think, would be a really good thing. There is just a final question here from Michelle Ashford.
Yeah.
We tell consumers how much we're spending in terms of billions of pounds, but never explain the value that delivers. I think it's a really good point. Just showing that, we're building this shiny new thing here doesn't explain, if you look at it from the point of view of a fish, how that will make a fish happier once that piece of kit is up and running and working effectively. There's a lot more coming in, but I'm afraid we're probably running out of time.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. So, unfortunately, we need to draw to the close. So, could you please join me thank Ian again for excellent